So we proceed now to Dr. Joshua Bishop, who's going to speak to us about the economics of conservation. Joshua Bishop is a natural resource and environmental economist whose work focuses on finding and promoting economically efficient approaches to nature conservation. He has a very great deal of experience in business, in the academy, in global organisations, and understands very well the challenges of public policy. So, Joshua, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, Carmen. I think I really have to begin just with a recognition and appreciation of the last two speakers in particular, who I think reminded us very eloquently and in an inspiring way of the importance of recognizing traditional values, cultural values, and rights, the need for adequate reparation for past injustices, and also the possibility of reconciliation based on respect and participation and true sharing of power. I'm going to take a much more reductive approach, and I make no apologies for that, both as an economist, but also because I think we all recognize the significance of economic forces in driving change in the landscape and the marine environment, and the need for us to really master those economic forces if we're going to achieve our aims. And that includes everybody's aims, I think, in this room. So I work for WWF. I'm not going to talk very much about the organization. I think you probably are familiar with it. What I'm going to do instead, because I started my career as a researcher, is take you through some theory, some methods, and some applications. And don't worry, I'll try to make this as painless as possible and as concrete as possible. And I'll end with some reflections on implications for protected areas and where we may be headed. I'm going to start with the big picture. Enrique put up the beautiful picture of our planet. In WWF, we like to put up a picture of how much we're using of that planet. And this is a kind of simple depiction of the fact that we are currently living beyond our means. We are consuming more of the biological capacity of this planet than it can generate on a sustained basis. And there are many organizations that have reflected on that. You can find evidence and reports showing the same kind of decline in natural capital published by the United Nations, by the World Bank, by the World Economic Forum, even by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the OECD. This is now consensus. It's not just a radical point of view. There's increasing recognition, I think, across the board that the current economic system is not sustainable. In WWF, we recently published a report called the Living Planet Report. It comes out every 2 years, and it gives one indicator of the kind of problem that we face. This is showing the decline in species around the world. It's based on ongoing monitoring of some 9,000 populations of 2,600 and some species. And it shows, as you can see, a gradual decline in populations of those species. The problem is particularly severe, as we all know, in the tropics. And when we try to understand what's underlying that, why are we in this situation, it's down to us. It's down to the human footprint on the planet, our use of natural resources, including atmospheric resources. And you'll notice that in this chart here from the Global Footprint Network, the biggest change over time has been the growth in emissions of greenhouse gases represented by carbon and measured in terms of the land area that would be required to absorb all those emissions. And as you'll also notice that we're well past the point where we were within the capacity of the planet sometime in 1976, and we're now up at about 1.5 planets. And that's one way of measuring. It's not the only way, and some may argue it's not the best way, but it's one indication of living beyond our means. We can break that down and identify how different countries are scoring on this index. Australia is there, number 7 in the world for ecological footprint. You probably all know that already. So that's the context, that's the big picture. Let me just bore you with a little bit of theory as to why this is happening. Why is our footprint so large? And I'm going to illustrate this theory with an example, because I think concrete examples often make theoretical points more clearly. So this is from a case study that was carried out in Thailand, comparing the economics of shrimp farming to the economics of mangroves, the values of those different land use options along the coast of Thailand. And what the market tells us is that you should chop down your mangroves and raise shrimp. It's obvious, right? They earn almost 10,000 US dollars per hectare in net present value terms. That's the sort of metrics that we like to use, compared with under $600 per hectare for mangroves. However, one of the things that we know is that markets are not telling the truth. And one of the reasons why markets are not telling the truth is because they reflect a lot of policy distortions, subsidies, taxes, what have you. In this case, incentives that are provided to shrimp farmers. If you strip out those subsidies that the shrimp farmers are enjoying but mangrove conservationists are not receiving, it changes the equation quite dramatically. Shrimp farms still look better, but not that much better. Then there are other values. You know this. Unfortunately, many decision makers don't know this well enough yet. The mangroves generate a lot of economic benefit in terms of protecting coastal infrastructure from storm surges. They provide a nursery for both inshore and offshore fisheries, and they also provide, as we know, forest products to local communities. We also know that shrimp farms are temporary. Typically, they will last a few years. They poison the land because of the chemicals they're using and the waste from the shrimp themselves, and they have to move on after a few years. If you factor in the damage cost or the restoration cost of those shrimp farms, and you now compare it with the public non-market benefits provided by the mangrove, the story changes completely. Obviously, we should be restoring and conserving mangroves and ripping out shrimp farms wherever we possibly can. That's not the situation we're in. The market does not tell the truth. So that's a bit of theory. How do we reach those conclusions? We have a whole suite of methods available to us. Environmental economists have spent the last 40, 50 years or so developing increasingly sophisticated and precise techniques for measuring these market and non-market values, trying to quantify the benefits provided by ecosystems, the storm surge benefits, the fish nursery benefits, the aesthetic and recreational benefits, etc. I don't have time to go into the details of these methods, but I will show you a couple of applications. We can look at different components of biological diversity, from ecosystem variety through to species and genetic variety. We can associate each of those components of biodiversity with a range of different ecosystem services, and then we can try to quantify the benefits derived from those services in economic terms. Just to give you a couple of examples, it's been calculated in a report for the UK government that if we were able to reduce deforestation in the tropics by 50%, not completely, just by 50%, we would avoid potential damages from climate change on the order of $3.7 trillion in net present value terms. And that's by a reputable team of economists. Not just a fanciful number. They did go through some effort to come up with that. At a smaller scale, we can look at pollination, and I'll come back to that in a minute, or we can look at genetic variety and the benefits that we derive from biotechnological research, pharmaceuticals, and other crop improvement techniques, and try to quantify what is the contribution of wild genetic material to those industries, what's the value added that is currently not being paid back to the resource, but is being pocketed, essentially, by the industry. Something like $640 billion. But let me just dwell a little bit on pollination, because I think it's an interesting one for protected areas as well. One recent study carried out by Nicolas Gallet in France, but with a global scope, tried to quantify the benefits of insect pollinators to agriculture. In some countries, farmers pay for pollination. They rent hives. But in many countries, they don't. This is just a free benefit from nature. And Nikolai and his colleagues estimated that the value of that pollination service is something like 10% of agricultural value added. So when you buy food in the shops, 10% of what you're paying should go back to the pollinators, but it's not. It's lost in the value chain, essentially. And some examples from the United States. We have a blueberry crop just in the state of Michigan worth over $120 million a year, completely reliant on pollination by bees. In this case, they're renting hives, and they do pay $1.5 million a year. Another example in Costa Rica, the coffee crop. Nobody's paying for the pollination. It's being provided by insect pollinators that live in the surrounding or neighboring forests. And some interesting work done by Taylor Ricketts and other colleagues when he was at WWF show that as you move away from the protected forests, the quality of your crop goes down. Your coffee yields go down, and the bad or pea berries go up. So they can quantify that as essentially a 20% benefit by being within a kilometer of these protected forests. Okay, that's a couple of examples of what you can do with these valuation methods and the kind of case that you might make based on that. So what? What do we do with those numbers? And here it starts to get interesting and perhaps more controversial. The challenge is, how do you turn those hypothetical values, those research reports, those academic studies into something real, into real cash flow? And there's a huge menu of mechanisms that have been developed and tested all around the world for turning those non-market values into cash flow, into market commercial considerations. It starts with unpicking those harmful subsidies. Stop paying people to destroy nature. It should be a no-brainer, but we still do it. Then we can start looking at other positive incentives, tax credits for conservation actions, for example. Certification and eco-labeling is a major area of focus for my organization, trying to encourage producers to shift from conventional production practices to more sustainable practices, and getting recognition for that in the marketplace, either in the form of a price premium or more often just better market access. Some governments and a few companies have experimented with paying landowners to provide ecosystem services, to restore natural habitat. We can do similar things with environmental responsibility and liability, essentially making those responsible for harm to the environment legally responsible for that damage at a level that is adequate or commensurate with the damage incurred. That can then be the basis of various environmental trading schemes. Sally and I were talking last night about biobanking in New South Wales, for example, is one case. You have many other initiatives like that in Australia, in New Zealand, and in many other countries around the world. And lastly, I just want to highlight public access to information. I think simply making the public, the citizenry, aware of environmental damages, obliging companies and even government agencies to report on their footprint is a big part of raising awareness and holding people to account and making them responsible for the goods and the bads. Experience with these instruments is very widespread, very diverse in rich countries and in poorer countries around the world. And the OECD likes to break it down into these 4 categories of taxes and subsidies and user fees. Those will be very familiar to protected area managers, park entry fees being a classic example of a user fee. I mentioned payments for ecosystem services. I'll come back to that. Biodiversity offsets. That's simply holding people to account for the damage they do, requiring them either to compensate themselves in kind or to pay a third party to provide that compensation. The value of that market, if you want to call it a market, is a little unclear because transparency is poor. People don't talk much about their deals, but it's in the billions. And of course, we also have a similar approach in the marine environment, tradable quotas for fisheries, which have had some success in different parts of the world. But I want to just focus a little bit on this idea of payments for ecosystem services. It's probably the largest example There are 5 national schemes identified by the OECD. I think that's Costa Rica, Mexico, China, one of the largest. The US has them. I think actually far more than 5. I'm not sure where that number comes from. But there are many of these examples around the world in agriculture, in forestry, amounting to some $6.5 billion per year, according to the OECD. It's not just governments that are paying, it's also private companies. So here's an example from Japan that I learned about recently. Sony has a subsidiary. They make semiconductors. They use a lot of water to produce semiconductors. And just purely on a voluntary basis, recognizing their responsibility for the depletion of groundwater resources, they've started a scheme that involves working with rice farmers to flood their paddies more than they would otherwise, and thereby restore the groundwater resources. And it involves some payments, inevitably, but not huge for a company like Sony. Mind you, they're losing money recently, so I don't know how long this will continue. It's not just rich countries. Developing countries also have many cases. This is from Tanzania. It's a forest carbon project involving planting of trees to mitigate climate change. I think this was the first project that was validated under the voluntary carbon standard. And it's important to point out that when you have these new schemes, these new payment arrangements, you do need fairly elaborate institutional structures around them to measure, to monitor, to verify and validate the transactions, that people are actually getting what they pay for, because very often you're paying for an intangible. You're paying for something that can't be seen or smelled, such as carbon sequestration. And very often these mechanisms can be combined with other productive activities. So here you've got sustained yield management of telephone poles, furniture, pallets, and so on. It's not that you necessarily have to do these things separately. You can add them, bundle them with other existing economic activities. So what does this mean for protected areas? Why am I going on about these sort of incentive schemes and payment systems? Well, you know far better than I do that parks and protected areas exist in a landscape, and there are new players competing for that landscape. So it's not just the agriculturalists who want to expand ranching and crop production, but you now also have carbon farmers. You have the biodiversity offset providers. You have the companies paying for watershed protection. More and more players contesting the use of the land. And parks and protected areas can play in that space as well. I think another thing that these instruments, these mechanisms or incentives have generated is a lot of fear and a lot of concern, particularly among rural communities who suspect that new money coming into the rural landscape for ecosystem services could mean new restrictions and loss of access to the land that they have traditionally used. So this is a cartoon showing some what look like indigenous peoples worried about the loss of access to a forest that has now been set aside for climate mitigation. This is not new to protected areas. You have a long-standing history of dealing with the different claims of people in the rural communities, their desire for access to land and other resources, but I think it's been accentuated to some extent by these new financial schemes. And I think another implication I want to highlight is greater awareness, perhaps because of these valuation exercises, perhaps because of the innovation around financing and incentive mechanisms. There's a greater awareness of the obligation or responsibility of the global community to pay for the conservation of biodiversity internationally. Not just at home, not just in their own backyards, but in other countries around the world. And this chart comes from a recent report prepared by the United Nations Development Program, looking at protected area financing in Latin America in particular, and quantifying the level of resources generated domestically, that's the yellow, the level of additional resources that are coming from aid flows, either from the Global Environment Facility or the World Bank or from bilateral aid. Those are the major categories. NGOs like WWF try, but we're small beer compared to the big institutions. And also demonstrating the gap. So when asking protected area managers what would be the minimum they need for basic operations, there's generally, as you would expect, people always want a little bit more for their activities. There's a gap. And when we try to break that down for the region as a whole, we can see that national governments, local governments are coming up with around 40% of the basic needs, international cooperation's covering 15%. And we're not talking huge numbers. I mean, this is 1% of Ministry of Environment budgets. It's not like this is a huge cost burden to these countries. And similarly, filling the gap, just going from where we are today to meeting basic needs for these protected areas across these 19 countries is not terribly expensive. We're looking at under $10 more per tourist visit, which is a doable figure. Okay. Lastly, I'm going to leap into the dark, the unknown, and speculate on the future, which is something only lunatics should do. But there are some things we do know about the future. We know pretty much how many people are going to be on the planet, and we know where they're going to live. And so we can expect another 2.5 billion people by 2050, and we know most of them are going to be living in cities, especially in Asia. And that has huge implications for land use and other resource use. Generally, we can anticipate continuing economic growth and expanding consumption, whether you're looking at energy, water, meat, protein, and all of that put together in a business as usual scenario means a greater footprint. So business as usual is not getting us where we need to be. There are more optimistic ideas. I talked a little bit about payments for ecosystem services, using valuation, trying to change economic indicators. There are people who anticipate and project significant expansion of some of these payment schemes. For example, payments for watershed protection by governments, currently around 5 billion, expected to go up to 6 billion by 2020, maybe 20 billion by 2050. Others even larger, certified agricultural products from 40 up to 900 billion, if you believe the projections. Another one to highlight here would be, where can I find it? Biocarbon. This really depends on governments coming to some agreement, and recent experience suggests they're having trouble with that, but there is potential, nevertheless, to get from very small amounts of money currently up to much larger sums in the future. All of this, as I said, is going to put more pressure on resources, sometimes for the benefit of conservation, sometimes for the benefit of rural people, but not necessarily always both. And there are interesting trade-offs and balances that need to be struck there. Just to summarize, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but just two simple points, really, that if I can boil it down. One is, do the math, right? We have the techniques. We can measure these values. They are significant, and they send an important signal to economic decision makers. This is a summary graphic from a report done by True Cost. It's a London-based consultancy. They did it for Principles of Responsible Investment, which is a forum for the biggest institutional investors in the world, several $1 trillion under management. What they did is they tried to quantify the environmental impacts of the 3,000 largest companies listed on stock exchanges around the world. And they have very detailed database to do that. They have input-output models. They know the technologies of production for across these different firms, different sectors around the world. They know what the greenhouse gas emissions are for those companies, how much water is being used, what other resources are being used, what toxics are being released by those different production processes. They can extrapolate that to the rest of the market and show for different sectors what is the magnitude of these environmental damages. The data is best for greenhouse gases, so that's why the green bars are so significant. When you look at food producers, as you would expect, water is a major focus, the loss of water values that's associated with production in those firms. Put it together and you're looking at something like 11% of global output. is damage, right? So again, this is the point is, how do we make the invisibility of nature more visible, or how do we make nature less invisible in our accounts? And there's interesting work going on to get companies to measure and report on these damages and liabilities, as well as the positive things they do, which hopefully will grow. Lastly, just to sum up again, it's not enough just to quantify and value and report. You also need to change the incentives. If you're going to influence financial flows, investment, production, and consumption decisions, you need to make it more costly to conduct business as usual. And there are lots of ways we can do that. We can impose limits on technology. We can impose user fees. We can introduce reporting requirements. We can name and shame. It's a big part of what NGOs like WWF do, to make it more costly to do damage. And we need to make it less beneficial to do damage. So consumer boycotts, or if we're allowed to, in some cases we can, use trade measures to try and make it less attractive to invest in business as usual. The flip side of that is we need to make it much more attractive to invest in conservation, to adopt the sustainable practices in every sector. And we can use tax policy for that. We can change permitting rules to make it a little easier for those who can demonstrate that they're meeting certain performance standards to get through the permitting process. Some banks in Japan have introduced differential interest rates that give a credit on your loan, essentially, for demonstrating that you're engaging in sound environmental management. And similarly, the benefits need to rise. All of this is described in much more and excruciating detail in a whole series of reports prepared under something called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. I had the honor to be associated with that project. They're all available on the web. You can get summary versions or several thousand pages if you're a glutton for punishment. And with that, I will say thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations and discussions. Thank you.
Are you happy to take a question or two?
If there's time, it's up to you.
That's okay, yes. We're running a little behind time, but I think given the presentation, would be great to have a question or two, as long as they're brief. Yes, at the back here.
Kia ora, Jan Hania, New Zealand Department of Conservation. It would seem there are a lot of tools available to reconcile the market difference between realising the cost impacts on the environment. It would also seem that it's a political decision now to implement those tools. How do we motivate that political decision making?
Okay, I think you put your finger on the real constraint. It's not technical, right? We know the technical answers. The challenge is political. I think Enrique also pointed this out in his talk. It takes political courage on the one hand. It takes citizen action and mobilization, I suppose, on the other hand, to put the pressure on the politicians. At the moment, I think probably too many people are content to let things slide. And there are activists, and there are activist organizations. I wouldn't say that WWF is a radical green group, but we're all doing what we can to try to raise the profile of these issues, try to generate the political momentum and the political consensus. But as we've seen in Australia, and this is before I arrived here, with the carbon price, it's not easy. You think you've won, and then you have to keep fighting the same battle over and over and over again. But I suppose just on that, if you look at the climate policy in Europe, where I've lived for the last 20 years of my life, they introduced the European Emissions Trading Scheme for carbon. The way they did it, they created a private asset. So essentially now there's a whole financial infrastructure of banks, insurance companies, brokers, what have you, whose livelihood depends on maintaining that market. So if you can create an asset that is private, essentially, but associated with an environmental benefit, that's very hard to unpick. And so that's why I hope the Australians make the transition as quickly as possible from a carbon price to a cap and trade scheme where there's a real asset that people will defend in the marketplace.
Anyone else? No, Joshua, it looks like
Okay.
at this stage it'll be over lunch. And
Okay.
thank you very much indeed
Thank
for
you,
your
Carmen.
contribution.
It was a
And
pleasure.
a small gift from
Thank
the
you so
organisers.
much.
Thank you.